Coming back for our final talk of the day. It's my pleasure to introduce Josh Simmons. Josh describes himself as a recovering web developer and open source advocate with a penchant for armchair philosophy, who's spoken at conferences around the world on community, open source, and web technology. So he's now a member of the Google Open Source Outreach team, where he manages the Google Open Source blog and automates all the things. He's also a volunteer Chief Financial Officer and board member for the Open Source Initiative, and he's here to speak to us about getting students into free and open source software.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you all for sticking around. I realize it's probably been a long day. Your brains are probably quite full at this point. So I will make this as fast, useful, and painless as possible. And please forgive me if I'm a bit nervous. I was never a good student, so being around educators. So yes, my name is Josh. I'm with the Google Open Source Outreach team. And part of what I'm here to talk to you about today is Google's student programs for getting students into free and open source software. But bigger than that, what other resources are there for getting students to learn by contributing to open source software? So I will briefly talk about why. I will discuss Google's student programs. I will acknowledge an elephant in the room, and I'll explain that later. And then I'll spend the rest of the talk covering a host of other resources. But first, a little housekeeping. I've planned for questions at the end, so as they come up, please write them down. We'll see how many questions we get to. If you have questions that we don't answer, that I'm not able to answer in the moment, or questions that come up later, feel free to tweet at me, email me, find me around the conference if you happen to stick around. And to be clear, I've worn many hats. I still wear quite a few. Today, right now, I'm wearing the hat of the individual Joshua Simmons, FOSS advocate. That's to say, my opinions don't represent my employer's past, present, future, though it is very relevant. What I'm saying is very relevant to my work. And lastly, my slides won't be available afterwards. You're not missing out. The video certainly will be available, and I will be tweeting all of the links on the Teaching FOSS hashtag. I'm sure a couple of them have already gone out, so they're pre-scheduled. You don't have to be a Twitter user to be able to search and find those links. So, enough preamble. Let's dive in. Why should students contribute to free and open source software? Why is it a valuable experience for them? I'll tell you what we at Google say, and then I will tell you what students say. First, they get real-world experience. They work on teams. They communicate with people across time zones and cultures, communicate across different mediums. They have to learn testing. They have to ship tests with the software they build. They have to use version control. You know, for all the students that are out there that may be fiddling around with code or building things, it's not often that they actually do a proper development workflow. And so working with FOSS is a way to get them ramped up on these tools that are critical when they get into industry. They create visible work artifacts, which is to say, when a student contributes to FOSS, there is code in the open, because it's open source, that they can point to and say, I did that. This is really, I can't overstate this. I spent over a decade doing work for hire as a web developer, and that was all proprietary. And most of those websites have rotted or are no longer online, so I don't really have a whole lot to show for that time. So anytime a student can contribute to open source software, that's creating a work history that they can always point back to. They build their network, which we all know is important. Students get acquainted with other students, other contributors on the projects. They're often working with mentors in these open source projects who will write them letters of recommendation, who will be there for years, sometimes for the entirety of their careers, to help them navigate their own career. And of course, while they're learning by contributing to FOSS, they're contributing to the common good, something that we're all benefiting from. They're contributing to the commons, which is a good in and of itself. They also learn about licensing and ownership, which is kind of an arcane topic that not a lot of people get exposed to, but it's really, really critical. Intellectual property is not fun for most people, but it's important. And contributing to open source software, they're going to, by osmosis, get a sense of what licensing means, what intellectual property is, why it's important. So that's all well and good, but how about a little perspective? What do the students say? Some of the themes that I see, these are quotes from people who participated in Google student programs. There's a theme of realizing how much there is to learn, a little bit of intellectual humility, especially the students who comment on realizing that they have to do testing and version control. You know, they can be whiz-bang building in their sandbox, but suddenly in an environment where there are these new expectations, they realize, okay, there's a whole world out there that I still have to learn about. They realize that there are some life skills as well that they learn in the process. They're engaged and motivated by working on things that people use and find useful. Again, speaking to real-world problems, this is a recurring theme, and it's one that resonates with me. I mentioned that I was a terrible student. I skated by on good exams, and most of my time was spent at home working on a computer, building whatever I found interesting. And I found it fun and really motivating to be building things that people would use. You know, I would launch a website and maybe there were only 10 people using it, but gosh, there were people using it. This is contrasted for me against things like worksheets, which, although critical, are not terribly motivating. So that's the why. And I think this is, frankly, preaching to the choir. You're here at PyConAU. Let me tell you a little bit about Google's open source programs. We have two programs to help students get into FOSS. First is Google Summer of Code and Google Codein. In this picture, you'll see some of the winners from this last year's Google Codein. These are students from all over the world that we flew out to San Francisco, including some of my teammates who actually run the programs. So Google Summer of Code, or GSOC for short, was founded 13 years ago at the behest of Google founder Larry Page's complaint. He complained that there were so many students in university who were working in CS programs, and then during the summer, they would get some sort of job, flipping burgers, manual labor, whatever it is, something that's not contributing to the advancement of their career. They might have been earning an income, but they weren't furthering their education or their career. So he threw some money at my team, specifically at Google Director of Open Source, Chris DeBona, and thus Google Summer of Code. This program pays students to work on free and open source software. So how does it work? Open source projects apply to participate. They muster mentors who are at the ready to support students throughout the program. And they also come up with project ideas for students to work on. So those might be might be small features or major bug fixes, things that they think are useful for the project, but also achievable by a student. We announce projects. Students look at the projects that they're interested in. They write proposals for those projects. And then the projects do a selection. They look at the project applications, and then they choose students. Those students then have about 4 months to work on this. In May is what we call the community bonding period. That's a time for the students to get acquainted with the community, with the code base, learn the norms, learn the etiquette, and get prepared for 3 months of development, lots and lots of development. There are evaluations throughout the process that students can either pass or fail. In those evaluations, the mentors basically say, is the student keeping up with what they said they would? Now, the mentors aren't there to penalize the student if maybe there was some unexpected complexity that they discovered in their project. That happens in software development. What the mentor is judging the student on is based on the communication and the planning. Do they realize when they've encountered something that will change the timeline of their project? Are they communicating on a daily, weekly basis, and keeping up. So these are the evaluations a student has to pass to get to the end, and students are paid based on where they live and how many evaluations they pass. So for instance, an Australian student participating in Google Summer of Code 2017 who completes the program is paid $6,000 US. But what about younger students? Right, so that's Google Summer of Code. That's for university students who are age 18 and up. About 7 years ago, Google Codein was founded. Google Codein is really part of this major push that we're seeing to teach students computer literacy and software development. And I guess our team figured, why not teach them through open source contributions? We're already doing that through Google Summer of Code. So GCI differs from GSOC, pardon the shorthand, differs from them in a few critical ways. It's for younger students. It doesn't involve an application process. It's an open contest where there are tasks that students claim. And we don't pay the students. Instead, we reward them with prizes. It runs during the Northern Hemisphere's winter break rather than over the summer, and is measured in weeks rather than months. So in thumbnail, how does GCI work? Projects apply to participate, and we require that the GCI projects have already participated in Google Summer of Code. Suffice it to say, working with young students is even more challenging than working with university students. And so we want to know that the organization, the open source project, is mature enough to be there and provide the support that these students need. So the projects apply, we accept them, and then they create an array of tasks from various difficulty levels, including tasks that are repeatable, like install Docker or install Linux, things that are necessary for them to do the more advanced tasks. Maybe it's just setting up the development environment, just setting up the development environment. The tasks also range in areas. So there are coding tasks, there are documentation, there's training, outreach, research, quality assurance, and user interface design. So there are an array of things that students can do. And the students claim one task at a time, and the tasks they're either given 3 days or 7 days to work on that task with the support of mentors. In both GSOC and GCI, participants get some level of swag and prizes for completing these tasks. For each project that participates in Google Codein, there is one finalist chosen and 2 grand prize winners who are chosen. And the project chooses those. That's not our team. Those are the people that we saw in that photo earlier. We fly them out wherever they are in the world. We fly them to San Francisco for a few days. They meet Google engineers. They meet people, Google engineers from their country. We show them San Francisco. And many of these people, they're either their first time on an airplane or their first time in the US or their first time in San Francisco. And it's an incredible experience seeing what it means to these students to go through this. So what do these students actually work on? I've been talking about this really in the abstract and mechanically, like what are the projects? So here we see a sampling of the projects that are participating in this year's Google Summer of Code. Last year we had 17 projects in GCI. This year we have 201 projects in GSOC. Some of those projects represent sub-projects. For instance, the Python Software Foundation represents many sub-projects that use Python. The projects range from operating systems to 3D modeling, robotics, gaming. There are humanitarian projects like OpenMRS and LibreHealth and MyFOSS initiative. And there are also projects that align with other subjects that they could be learning, chemistry, mathematics, astronomy, etc. So the bold names on this list are projects that explicitly involve some sort of Python. The projects that are dark, in a dark color there, are projects, well, there are people from those projects here at PyConAU, and specifically, Beware and Tim Videos, they're going to be participating in the sprints at the end of this conference. So if you're sticking around for the conference, or even if you're not and you're still in town, I encourage you to go to the sprints and talk to the people behind those projects, because they are projects that are very welcoming and are great for getting students on board. So as I mentioned, for Google Summer of Code, it requires students to apply. And that requires some elbow grease and a little luck. It's a little competitive. Now, while Google Codein doesn't require applications, there are certainly ways to prepare for the program. And so I'm going to briefly talk about what it means to get prepared for Google Summer of Code, knowing that a subset of this is useful for GCI as well. So not every project participates every year, but most come back. So looking at who has participated is a good way to gauge who is going to participate again. A student should look at the projects that are interesting to them and are using technologies that they have some experience with. The most successful students explore code bases and get acquainted with the project communities via issue trackers, via IRC, Slack, whatever it is. When the projects are announced, the ones that are participating for the current year, they'll provide those project ideas. And at that point is when when students can really start working on their proposals. Now, students don't need to write their proposals based on the projects that the organizations suggest. They can write their own proposals. In that case, it's particularly important for them to talk to the mentors and the people behind the project so that they can help refine that proposal and make sure that it's a reasonable scope, something that's useful, something that they can support. We, again, encourage students to communicate with the projects through this process. And we list the project's contact info on the website. And then hope. So I told you I was going to address an elephant in the room, and this is that moment. GSOC and GCI are timed to coincide with summer and winter breaks in the northern hemisphere. This means students in the southern hemisphere might find that GSOC and GCI fall partially or completely on top of their school year. So while this doesn't dissuade students, we have countless students who participate from India who do it on top of school, it does make things more difficult. That's why I'm going to spend the rest of this talk sharing with you other resources for getting students into FOSS. So first, resources for instructors. Again, these links are all being tweeted. Search that hashtag, you'll find them all. Teachingopensource.org is a hub of useful information on the why, how, and what other people are doing to get students into FOSS. That's a great jumping off point. POSSE, Professor's Open Source Software Experience, is a workshop run in the US and Europe for uni instructors who are creating curriculum that gets their students to contribute to humanitarian free and open source software projects. It hasn't been run in Australia or New Zealand yet, and so if there's anybody who's interested in helping to bring it here, please let me know, because I would love to put the organizers in touch with you. Similarly, FOSS Desktops for Kids is not run here yet. That is a program that refurbishes desktop computers to help schools that don't even have the hardware for students to learn on. And they install open source software on those machines such that there are no licensing fees, et cetera. That's only in the US, but I know the man who runs that program, Patrick, and he would love to expand that to Australia and New Zealand. So again, if you're interested, you know, schools that need that kind of thing, please let me know, and we'd love to put something together. Open Source Guide is a project recently launched by GitHub. It contains useful information like how to contribute to open source or how to create an open source project. Open Source Way, also known as opensource.com, is a community news website run by Red Hat, which contains a lot of useful information. There are 2 articles in particular that I just tweeted that I encourage you to take a look at. That is, of course, sponsored by Red Hat, and Red Hat has their own host of resources for educators who want to get their students into FOSS. And I encourage you to explore all of those things. OK, so let's talk about what's the student-facing things here. Coder Dojo is a worldwide volunteer-run network of clubs for young people who want to learn and work with technology, in particular open source technology. There are over 100 clubs in Australia, so this is not one of those US-centric things. Outreachy is like Google Summer of Code, but specifically for people who are underrepresented in the tech industry, like women and ethnic minorities. This year's LinuxConf AU raised upwards of $29,000 to place 3 interns for that program. It's a wonderful program, and I encourage people to check it out. Rails Girls Summer of Code, like Outreachy, is for caters to women who are underrepresented in the tech industry. It's not just for Rails, and it's different from Outreachy and GSOC insofar as you apply as a team and not as an individual. Season of KDE is an example of an open source project who's created their own GSOC-like thing. And then there's, of course, the x.org Endless Vacation of Code, which has an excellent name. There's also the European Space Agency's Summer of Code in Space. I didn't list them here because their website's down right now, but I'm pretty sure they're still active. So there are those programs, and then there are self-guided options for students who might want to do this on their own time. One of the great ways to get started is look at issue tags. There's been issue tags being the tags that one would use on an issue tracker or on a website like GitHub to describe the nature of an issue. And projects are increasingly using tags to identify projects or tasks that would be useful for someone or approachable for someone who is new to open source development or development in general. There are a couple Twitter handles and websites that aggregate this stuff so students don't actually have to search all that hard for it. The ones on the right there are those handles and websites. Some other self-guided options are just to approach a project that is known as Newbie Friendly. Some open source projects are more welcoming communities than others. Some open source projects have done a better job of building on-ramps for newcomers than others. And these four are outstanding. Beware, mentioned earlier, which is present at this conference, is a collection of projects that enable Python developers to build websites and native desktop and mobile apps using Python. It's kind of magical, and it's a great project that's very, very welcoming. Habitica is a role-playing game that helps people build good habits and fight procrastination. So being that it's a game for a good cause, it's kind of a fun thing to contribute to. Hoodie is a project that helps developers build websites and applications that work offline. And Public Lab, a personal favorite of mine, is a community that develops open source tools for environmental science and citizen science. But there are a lot more than just these four projects that people can check out. For instance, even if a student can't participate in Google Summer of Code or Google Codein, the projects that do participate in our programs necessarily structure themselves so that there are on-ramps for newcomers, right? If they haven't built those on-ramps by the time they start the program, they certainly have by the end. And what that means is having decent documentation, having mentorship, having a culture that doesn't say, doesn't just tell a student to RTFM. These are projects that you can find that are almost guaranteed to be a good environment for people. So we talked about why contributing to open source is a great way to learn. We discussed the Google programs, GSOC and GCI. And we covered a bunch of other resources for you as instructors and also for students to get started. We will be announcing dates for the next two Google programs in the next 4 weeks. You can find that information on those websites. My hope is that you will incorporate contributions to open source into your curriculum as much as you can, insofar as it's valuable for the student and valuable for the greater community. So I'll say it one last time. I have tweeted a whole lot of links using that hashtag. You don't have to be a Twitter user. So just search those things. You'll find all of those references. With that, questions?
Thank you, Josh. Raise hands and I'll bring the mic over.
So I don't know how easily you're going to be able to address this one, Josh, but we've got working with kids and letting them interact with people outside of schools is really problematic here in Australia. Just to tutor people in an online forum requires every person involved to have some kind of working with children check in their relevant state or territory. So you're saying here, get involved in open source, that's going to be interacting with a lot of people who maybe don't hold those qualifications. How would teachers deal with that issue if they're trying to sell this to school leadership or to approach these groups to say, hey, we want to get involved, but you need every single person who works on your project to get a working with children check?
Right. That is a very good question, and as you anticipated, not one I'm actually all that prepared to answer. But that's something that I would be happy to follow up on because I know that I know that it's happening. And I think, for instance, the teachingopensource.org is something that covers it pretty thoroughly. If you come up to me afterwards, I'd love to get your contact information so I could follow up with you on that.
Any further questions?
Thank you for your talk. I wanted to ask is it FOSS desktop for kids? Do you know if they would be interested to expand to Africa?
Absolutely, yes. FLOSS Desktop for Kids is a program of the Open Source Initiative, and I know that one of that organization's priorities this year, in fact, has been expanding, becoming more of an international organization, Africa specifically. We will have people at some open source conferences in Africa next year as we celebrate our anniversary, which is to say that we will have people on the ground. We would love to talk to you, and even ahead of that, please, let's exchange contact information because we would love to roll that program out there.
Cool. I love making those kinds of connections. Any further questions? Okay. Thank you very much, Josh.
Thank you.